Hello, everyone. My name is Theodora Scorado. I'm Executive Director with Environmental Health Trust, and I am presenting with Dr. Cindy Russell a webinar, Enhancing Technology for the San Francisco Unified School District. The United Educators of San Francisco issued a resolution in 2018, a resolution on enhancing technology safety. This was after the California Department of Public Health released a cell phone radiation advisory on how to reduce exposure to the radio frequency radiation from cell phones. And I'm going to briefly summarize the resolution, and then Dr. Cindy Russell is going to present. And then I'm going to talk about policies that are happening internationally and in the United States, and then go into how practical advice for teachers on what they can do in their classroom, on what schools can do, and what administrations can do at various levels. So the United Educators of San Francisco resolution first summarizes about how the California Department of Health issued guidelines on how to reduce exposure.
California officials say the warning about keeping a cell phone pressed up against your ear was issued largely because radio frequency emissions could be damaging, particularly to children.
Now children on average are starting at the age of 10 and using cell phones for a lot of activities.
California's Department of Public Health recommends using the speakerphone or headphones, sleeping at least an arm's length away from it, and avoiding keeping it in your pocket. The move comes after a 3-year-long legal battle by Joel Moskowitz, who forced the state to release a long secret study of cell phone risk. And Apple includes a warning of sorts on all iPhones, but it's not easy to find. You have to go to Settings, General, About, down to the bottom here to Legal, then to RF Exposure, where finally Apple suggests you use the speakerphone or headphones to reduce exposure to radio frequency emissions.
That cell phones emit radio frequency radiation, which is microwave radiation. They're information carrying waves. That's the invisible way that cell phones communicate. That children may be more affected. The science suggests that radiation may impact human health. And they also cite the Ashland, Massachusetts public schools, which is the first public school to institute district-wide best practices for reducing wireless radiation exposures. And the resolution goes on to say, and in the corner you can see that, which you can download from the California Department of Public Health, that the California Department of Health guidelines recommend keeping the cell phone away from your body, reducing or avoiding the use of cell phones when it's sending out high levels of radio frequency radiation. And they actually go into detail as to situations where you will receive high levels of radio-free radiation, which would be in areas of low signal, like in your basement, or also when you have large data files, videos. They recommend not sleeping with your cell phone, removing the headset when you're not on a call, and not relying on radiation shields. Therefore, it be resolved that the Labor Management Health and Safety Committee discuss the dissemination and development of these guidelines into the schools for students and parents, maybe in the handbook, for staff, and posting the cell phone radio frequency radiation safety guidelines in every classroom, and encouraging the use of Ethernet connections using Ethernet rather than Wi-Fi in the school to reduce the radio frequency radiation from the Wi-Fi. So now I am going to change my slides to Dr. Cindy Russell. She is the Executive Director of Physicians for Safe Technology.
Hi, I'm Dr. Cindy Russell, and I'm Executive Director of Physicians for Safe Technology. And I'm a practicing physician. I've been working on toxins in the environment for over 25 years and witnessing the epidemic of breast cancer. So I became very interested why there was an epidemic of breast cancer. And when I was researching a proposal to place a cell tower in my daughter's middle school, I discovered that the cell towers and wireless devices that support them are fundamentally harmful to biological processes, both at low power and high power. A lot of people say, what is wireless technology? Well, wireless technology is a transfer of data and information on radio waves in the electromagnetic spectrum without cables or wiring. And you can't really see it, hear it, you can't feel it, but these wavelengths, they're transmitted through the air and received by the device, which transforms that data into sound or visual media. This radiation, microwave radiation that's currently used, passes through and it's absorbed by anything that contains water, and that includes plants, trees, animals, human beings to varying degrees. The electromagnetic spectrum. That is a continuum. You may all know as teachers that this is a continuum of all the electromagnetic energy waves that are arranged according to frequency and wavelengths. The longer wavelengths are to the left of the visible light, and these are radio waves and microwaves. When you go to the right of the longer wavelengths are to the left, and the shorter wavelengths are to the right of visible light. And to the left, you see the non-ionizing radiation, which are the radio waves and microwaves. On the right is the gamma radiation, which everybody understands are harmful. And we do have natural electromagnetic radiation that's emitted by the sun and earth. It's very low power. It's what we evolved in. And we're protected from the UV radiation from the sun and cosmic rays largely by the ozone layer. So for years, we used to think that the electromagnetic spectrum in the microwave and radio frequency was completely harmless. We did think that, of course, about X-ray machines and found out, but that was harmful. But now we really understand that there is biological effects of that non-ionizing radiation. And our modern telecommunications are now based on that wireless technology. And it creates these artificial electromagnetic wavelengths and that we have not really been exposed before. These are wireless devices that you can see in the next slide that include your cell phone, your routers, computers, your cordless phones, and now we have watches, and now we're going to have wearable devices as well. Cell towers are required to transmit that data information and add to that radiation that's emitted. It's important to note that the radiation does bounce off metal. It concentrates in rooms that have a lot of metal. And then with the next slide, you'll see that the FCC standards are obsolete. The microwave radar was developed in the 1930s by physicists. And since then, it's been used in the military, in communications, and a key factor for Allied victory in World War II. And in 1984, cell phones were first introduced. But the fact that cell phones were introduced is only based on heat and as the only endpoint of harm. But since then, there's been an increase in the background radiation level, and we have more and more exposure to these frequencies. So again, this is a cooking standard. It's lower power, but studies have shown that even in this lower power, you're going to have biological effects because, as we're going to point out, we are electrical beings. So we have communication and cellular signaling through electrical and biochemical means. And it makes sense that it's not just the heat, because we know that there are endocrine disruptors that hijack our metabolism. These are toxins. And in that same way, this electromagnetic radiation can also cause harm. One of the other issues, of course, we know is that the vulnerable populations, such as the fetus and pregnant women, babies, elderly, and those with chronic illness, are not really considered in these FCC standards. And we know that cumulative effects are really important, and that's not taken into consideration. If you look at the bottom of the slide, you can see also that the radio frequency bioeffects that are reported in the Bioinitiative report are very low. They're in the range of 0.003 microwatts per centimeter squared, yet the standards allow up to 1,000 microwatts per centimeter squared. So there really needs to be evaluation of these standards. We're going to look at mechanisms of toxicity next. And a lot of people have said for years there's no mechanism, but now we actually know that there is a mechanism of harm, and actually probably more than one, but one that's been well studied is oxidation And that is basically the creation of what we call reactive oxygen species. And when that radiation is absorbed, it creates a cascade of inflammation, and it's a very complicated molecular process, but it basically winds up contributing to oxidation. And there are 93 of 100 studies that were reviewed that showed this. So it's pretty well studied. And voltage-gated calcium channels have also been studied. There's harm to the membranes. So there's many studies on this. And what we look at when we see this kind of radiation when it hits us is that it's like a punch. So people go, well, it you know, doesn't really, it's just going into your cells. It's not harmful, but they can average these kinds of radiation levels, and they say that they're okay because they're below standards. But we really need to look at the peak levels and the pulsations, because it's those pulsations that actually hit the membrane, punch the membrane, and injure the cell. And that's called modulation. When you look at oxidation and you look at toxins in the environment and chemicals, that oxidative phenomenon is injurious. Doesn't matter if it comes from a cell phone or it comes from a chemical or pesticide or industrial chemical, in that same way. And many studies have associated this oxidation with harm to our biological processes, including chronic disease and aging. And then essentially, if you want to, for an inanimate object, you can think of oxidation as creating rust. And for us as humans, aging and other damage, which we're going to look at. So we're going to go now to the next slide, and that's evidence of harm. So when you look at that, there's evidence in basic science, case studies, epidemiology, and long-term prospective studies that have shown harm. And this is in many areas. It's broad harm. Cancer, if you note that the microwave radiation that we're exposed to now is considered a group 2B carcinogen, a possible carcinogen. But there's been enough evidence now it's accumulated to list it as a group 1 human carcinogen, according to many scientists, including Dr. Miller. So because it's not been reevaluated with the current studies looking at biological harm. There's also harm to our reproductive organs, sperm, ovaries, embryos. There's many studies, neurologic harm to brain cells, memory. We're going to talk about a little bit of these in a minute. Environmental harm to plants, birds, trees. And again, stress and oxidation in cells is a mechanism. Cumulative exposure needs to be taken into account. We're going to go ahead with the next slide now. One of the things that most of us know is that blue light can be toxic to our bodies. And the way that blue light can affect us, it can suppress melatonin, and that leads to disruption of sleep and circadian rhythm. We all know that. That's why there's all these blue light screens on our computers now. But melatonin, as it winds up, is a wonderful antioxidant. It's our own internal vitamin C. And it really is important to protect us from harm from oxidants. And studies have shown that low melatonin enhances cancer growth, and also can be associated with other chronic disease processes. Some newer studies, interestingly, have found that this oxidation can affect mitochondria and damage photoreceptor cells in our retina. And these are new studies by Osborne and Ratnakia. So we have to be really careful about our exposure to digital media in general and how much we're exposed to. In the next slide, you're going to see there is evidence both in basic science with regards to wireless technology acting as a neurotoxin. And again, it's the same sort of mechanism with oxidative stress and inflammation, DNA damage. There's also decrease in neurotransmitters. So this could help to explain why there may be this association with neuropsychiatric problems. Interestingly, the basic science and animal studies show there's damage to the hippocampus specifically, and that is the memory center. And there can also be death of neurons. So the basic science literature, and there's dozens and dozens of studies, you can find them on our website, mdsafetech.org, that show all of this, these interactions and adverse effects. So then in the next slide, you're going to see how does that play out with some of the studies, the human studies. So these are just a few studies that I've picked out in our research. Speech delay. In 2007 at the American Academy of Pediatrics meeting, a 30-minute, they found that they relayed a study, and they looked at a study that showed 30-minute increase in screen time provided a 49% increase in the risk of expressive speech delay. So that's one of the first that's really documented this, and I'm sure there's more studies that are ongoing. And with regards to memory, in 2018, Forrester, they looked at 22 Swiss schools, and they found overall that there was a decrease in their memory scores the more that they used their phone. In 2017, looking at ADHD and cell phone use, that very large study, 5 cohorts, 5 countries, Denmark, Korea, Netherlands, Norway, Spain, they found an increase in maternal cell phone use caused more ADHD and emotional problems. And Dr. Paul in 2016 wrote a comprehensive article on neuropsychiatric effects. There were 26 studies that he looked at. There's more now, and this showed fatigue and headache and other symptoms related to exposure to cell phones and wireless. And then the next study, next slide, you're going to see Wi-Fi in schools. Well, there's a lot of Wi-Fi in schools, and this is an important thing to look at, because you not only have the routers, you've got cell phones that are there, you have whiteboards that are wireless, and this really can be a problem for some people. They say you've got to have the whiteboards, help the teacher to structure the lessons. It makes learning more fun. It increases level of engagement. It makes the revision of lessons convenient, and also for students with disabilities. So they say there's a lot of convenience to it, but unfortunately a lot of these whiteboards, this is one of the times when students say that they become electrosensitive, is when the whiteboard goes up or the whiteboard's on or they're near the whiteboard, they have these symptoms which are similar to acute symptoms of exposure or electrosensitivity, which we're going to talk about in a minute. So, so it's really important to look at all those issues. And the other thing, of course, is that all those wireless devices are supported not only with Wi-Fi in the class, but the cell towers that are nearby, and that needs to be taken into account. So if we go to the next slide, we're going to look at some of these symptoms of electrosensitivity. And for me, when I've looked at this in the studies, this was one of the most difficult things for me to wrap my head around, because I read some of the studies that said it's all in people's heads, it's all psychiatric, there is no electrosensitivity. But I picked out some of these that said, no, it really is a real phenomenon, it's reproducible. And there are various reasons for this. But one of the members of our scientific advisory board, Dr. Scott Eberly, is a hospice physician in Petaluma, and he wrote in 2014 his experience with electrosensitivity after he had a carbon monoxide poisoning. And the PG&E came out, they removed it, the carbon monoxide, but he still felt fatigued at times. And when he was out in the wilderness, he had no problem. But when he came back home, when he was in the presence of cell phone and the computer, he would notice that he would have these symptoms, and their headache, dizziness, brain fog, many symptoms that are related to this that you can see. And he would have fatigue for quite a while. And so he did double-blind studies and said, okay, how can this, is this really true, or is it just me? And he really found out that he really was. So he wrote this article about how difficult it is for people with electrosensitivity to be taken seriously even. And I've met him, I've talked with him. He is just a wonderful person, and I really appreciate his contributions. And you can find these on our website under the electrosensitivity tab. There's scientific literature, but there's also another review of topics literature where you can read about his experience, and he also published literature on this. So I think it's something to think about for school nurses, especially, that if they have kids that are coming in, say, I've got a headache, try to really get a sense of how, a lot of people have headaches. Is it really related to the presence of wireless devices, and at school, at home, and so forth? And take it seriously and ask questions. I'm going to, next slide. Children are more vulnerable. They have thinner skulls. They have more water in their brains, and also, of course, they're just developing, so their organs are immature. They can absorb 2 to 5 times more radiation in their skulls, and you can see this is Fernandez's article of this year showing that with cell phone and also virtual reality or VR placed close to the head, they're going to absorb more than an adult. And in that regard, it's something to really take seriously, because more schools are adding VR to their educational process. And while I've read some reports that a lot of people are concerned with the VR for various sundry reasons, and so it's not as popular as it has been, I'm so sorry, that now they're trying to really make this more available in schools and also hospitals and in medicine, where it may have some uses, but one must be really careful about using it, introducing it, and also the long-term exposure. Next slide. And also to note, this is very close to the brain, which is very vulnerable. So with regards to infertility, next slide, there are many studies, dozens and dozens of studies on infertility and how this affects sperm. It affects motility and DNA, also oxidative damage to the ovaries, embryos, and also a wonderful study by Dr. Dikun Lee. He's a Kaiser physician that published an article this last year looking at 930 pregnant women, and he looked at just an everyday exposure and put a monitor on them and looked at their magnetic fields, electrical fields, and found that with just an everyday exposure, those that had the highest exposures overall had almost a 3-fold increase in miscarriage rate. And it's one of the best studies that's been done on this. It's really carefully done. So we really have to take these studies really seriously, very carefully done. They're over a long term. Now we're going to look at breast cancer, and I'm a reconstructive surgeon, so it's been especially important to me to look at this. Dr. West, John West, had published an article back in 2013, and he looked at, he had a case of a woman, he had actually several cases, where they had placed their cell phone in their bra, and they developed a cancer in the same area where their phone was placed. And in one instance, there are 4 antennas on this phone, all around the phone, that specific multifocal tumors, there are multiple tumors in the breast. They were in those specific areas where those antennas were. And at that point, he was actually sort of pushed by his patient to say, this is a real issue, we should try to, get the word out. And then, I've had patients, and I've had other people say, yeah, that's where I put my phone, and that's where my tumor is. And very concerned about this. And so, we all know not to carry our phones in our bra, or if you do, have it on airplane mode. The next topic that we're going to talk about in the next slide is cancer and the NTP study. Well, this NTP study, National Toxicology Program, did a long-term study. It was 10 years on cell phones and cancer. It was $25 million. The peer review came out. It's basically showed clear evidence of carcinogenicity for heart tumors, significant increase for brain tumors, and also tumors of the adrenal medulla. And in addition, a fairly significant risk for prostate. When you look at the controls, most of the controls did not get tumors, and it was much lower than their normal rate. And there's some question of whether or not, because these rats were shielded from this electromagnetic frequency radiation, that maybe that was protective for them. If you look at some of the other evidence in that study, it definitely showed DNA damage and also showed this unusual cardiomyopathy, which was similar to aging. And that's a concern because it points out again that this radiation does pass through our bodies and can cause many different kinds of effects. If you look at cancer rates, brain cancer now is rising in England. People have said, well, the brain cancer is not rising, so there's no evidence of harm, even though Dr. Hardell and others have found studies showing that a strong association between brain cancer and use of the cell phone on the same side of the head. But now the brain cancer rates are starting to rise. And if you look at brain cancer in the United States, it's the most common cancer age 0 to 19, and second is testes, and third is leukemia. There is an abstract published at the American Academy of Pediatrics recently by Siegel, and it showed basically an increase in all pediatric cancers as well. So, and that could be different things, but it's interesting to note. So in the next slide, what should we do? Well, we need the standards to be reevaluated. We need to have biological based standards that are based on the science, which is now being ignored because, again, all of these standards are based on heat and not biological effects that are seen and identified in all of these different kinds of studies that are broad. That we need to really look at these. I really appreciate, and we all appreciate, the California Department of Public Health guidelines, and basically their message is to reduce your exposure. If you go to the Austrian Medical Association, and that's on our website, you can look that up, and I'm sure on Environmental Health Trust as well has much information for you. They have really detailed guidelines on the diagnosis of electrosensitivity and how to reduce exposure. We have links to that on ours, and we actually have an electrosensitivity questionnaire as well. But they advise reevaluating the standards. And the California Medical Association passed a resolution in 2014 to also ask for reevaluation of standards that were protective of human health and environmental health. There's some really good articles. Dr. Paul has an article about risks to 5G in the EU and so forth. And he points out really that a lot of these really wonderful studies that are really carefully done, they're robust studies, and these studies are not taken into account when they're looking at these new standards. They do list them, and Dr. Paul has done a really wonderful job and in really carefully looking at every study that they've looked at, and those which they've included and those which they've basically dismissed or not looked at and said, we're not going to include those in our deliberations. And I think it's a real problem because we want to be science-based. And if we're science-based, then we have to include the science that actually is there and isn't just convenient for some. In the next slide, there are other issues that are related to wireless technology, and we just shouldn't forget about them. One is this deployment of 5G, small cells, and many of you, if you're aware in your neighborhoods, there are a lot of now sort of battles going on in cities that they wish to deploy all these cell towers every 200 meters because 5G is smaller wave technology, and it's going to have on every block these small, quote, small cell towers. There's a lot we can say about that. But in addition to this, all these loss of these 5G deployment, we're going to have loss of our landlines, and AT&T plans in 2020 to remove these. They already have got this sort of in the pipeline. I think people are not really aware of that, and they're trying to switch everybody over. But as it winds up, landlines are one of the safest, most secure, and cheapest ways for all of us to communicate and also have more privacy. If you look at everybody being in the cloud, we're going to have more energy use, more downloads, more servers, and in this, we're going to have more global climate change. It can contribute to more global climate change, and there's some interesting articles on this. And least we not forget about privacy and cybersecurity, which are all just imminent threats and constantly being worked on, which are very difficult to achieve, however, especially when you're having a lot of these small cells and so forth that are going to be communicating at all times. So stay tuned for all that. In the next slide, you can see there's been some published literature. I published an article on wireless technology and public health, and also one in our local county medical association on a 5G future. And I think one of the things that is important to bring up too is that, you know, these are not just the published studies that we've had here that are looking at it. There are military studies from decades ago that have shown, from NASA, shown signs of electrosensitivity in radar workers, and much has been brought up about the adverse health effects of this. And the next slide shows our race to 5G, and that's the next thing on everybody's mind just because of these cell towers and how initially they are not going to have just 5G, they're going to have all the different frequencies, 2G, 3G, 4G frequencies mixed together. And what's that going to look like? And we want to make sure, you know, if we are in this race to 5G, which scientists, including myself, feel we should have a moratorium on 5G instead of a race to 5G, we want to just, you know, be careful. And we need to make that pit stop in the middle of this race so that we're not winding up on a crash course for public health. And that's really the main issue. Our group, and the next slide, Physicians for Safe Technology. Our motto is, our vision is a world where technology serves our needs without undermining our physical, psychosocial, or environmental health. And you can visit our website. And I want to thank you. Last slide is, the message is that we really need to reduce our exposure, just like the California Department of Public Health says. We need to wire classrooms. We need to look at the blue light and screen time reduction for our eyes. And our melatonin and our sleep. We need to use best practices in classrooms, as Theodora has brought up, and also really look at the whiteboard use. It seems to be one of those issues that really comes up a lot. And banning cell phones in schools. I know Theodora is probably going to talk about this, but France has recently banned cell phones in schools, elementary and middle schools, and also banned cell towers near schools. There's a problem in a city called Ripon, California, where they're having increased cancer rates, and we really need to look at this. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Right. Thank you, Dr. Russell. And there's over 250 scientists who've signed on to the call for the World Health Organization to take action on this. And then more recently, an appeal to ask for biologically based limits. Because the International Commission, the ICNIRP, is not including a lot of the research or using that to substantiate our limits, which are based on animal studies from the 70s and 60s, and a few from the 80s, actually. It's not based on current science, at least the FCC limits documentation is not.
And that's exactly right. And the main thing about that is that these 200 plus scientists that have asked for reevaluation of the safety standards, a moratorium on 5G, and the inner guidelines, as you've said, these are all people who've worked in this field and are the researchers who do this work. So it's similar to climate scientists. You know, the vast majority of climate scientists say there is global climate change, and some others say there isn't. But the people who work in this, who've done this research, are very concerned and are coming together to ask the governments to look at this again.
Yeah. Well, thank you. There are actually over a dozen countries which advise that the public, and especially children, reduce cell phone radiation. Now, some of the countries that you see here say children should reduce exposure because they are more vulnerable. Some are very clear that that adults and children should. There's a variety of recommendations for everything you see here. The United States is not on this list because we say if you are worried, you can reduce exposure in these ways. And we give two or three tips, which actually are quite minimal because there's so many ways to reduce exposure. And some of these countries have several pages related to how to reduce exposure. You can go to the Environmental Health Trust website and go to our policy section and see all of the recommendations, and I'm going to briefly talk about a few of them. In the United States, the Maryland State Children's Environmental Health and Protection Advisory Council, which is a 19-member council of pediatricians, public health experts. They have representatives from the House and the Senate of the Maryland State, and also the Department of Education and other state departments, has issued a recommendation on Wi-Fi in schools, which does recommend limiting radio frequency radiation in schools as much as feasibly practical. And they have listed a lot of ways to do that, such as wired devices in the classroom. Some of I think the low-hanging fruit, so to say, is that when there's a new build, putting into the building design ways so that this can be more convenient, because making sure that there's the availability to plug in your devices, wired phones, etc. And that's all on the website.
Welcome back. Now, just last week, Adelaide CBD became one of the world's biggest Wi-Fi hotspots. For the tech-savvy, it's a priceless convenience. But Wi-Fi has some health experts worried. They fear it's damaging our health and we won't know the full effects for generations to come. Here's Jade Robram with one Adelaide school that's taking no chances.
Exposures in a school environment are actually much higher than in any home environment. And whether or not you're using the Wi-Fi, that router is emitting microwave radiation, and so you're constantly exposed.
Dr. Magna Havas is a leading expert on electromagnetic radiation in Canada. She believes there's a great risk when it comes to Wi-Fi and children.
It's an emerging health issue because we've got evidence now that it's been linked to cancers, to reproductive problems, to electrohypersensitivity, to heart palpitations. So we're really dealing with a tsunami.
Wi-Fi is now considered a necessity in most schools and workplaces. It's revolutionised the way we work, learn and live. Even though Wi-Fi emits low-rating radiation waves, the problem is it's everywhere.
Progressive countries like France, Russia, Israel, Italy, China, Switzerland, their exposure standards are 100 times lower than what's allowed in Australia.
Not having technology as a focus means that our children are thinking in a much more responsible and productive way.
One place that switched off its Wi-Fi connection is Upper Sturt Primary School. Principal Barb Jones.
There's not enough evidence that Wi-Fi is completely safe at this stage. We haven't had it long enough.
It was very difficult to find a school that was Wi-Fi free.
Tony Glab, mother to Alexander and Christina, was adamant she wanted to send her son to a Wi-Fi free zone after learning the World Health Organization classified it as a potential carcinogen.
We have those lessons from history where we know that governments take often decades to respond and act in the interests of public health and safety, and that's clearly shown with asbestos and smoking and lead. So once again, this is one of these issues that potentially in 20, 30 years' time we may look back and say, gee, why did we do that to our children?
Students still have the use of computers, but they're hardwired, which means no radioactivity is emitted.
We wanted our children to understand that computers are a tool. They're not the first part of research, or they don't have to be.
It's an idea that countries like France, Russia, Italy, China and Switzerland implemented in schools, kindergartens and daycare centres years ago. But yet Australia won't do it.
The exposure standards are not geared towards children, they're geared towards the 6-foot healthy man. I don't see a 6-foot healthy man in a childcare centre, a kindergarten or in most primary schools.
The Baby Safe Project, which is an effort between Environmental Health Trust and Grassroots Environmental Education. There is an appeal signed by over 200 doctors, educators, and experts about recommending how to reduce exposure to pregnant women, specifically because of research which has found impacts to the developing fetus. Dr. Hugh Taylor, who's chief of obstetrics at Yale Hospital, presented at the press conference when this campaign was initiated about his research, his team's research, which found in pregnant animals, in mice, that the babies, the offspring, when there had been cell phone radiation exposure in utero, they scored poor on memory, they were more hyperactive, symptoms that would be akin to, similar to ADHD in humans. And there's also studies that have looked at prenatal exposure and impact on behavior, and that is, again, all on the website and on Physicians for Safe Technology, as well as the HTrust. The Baby Safe Project has 10 ways to reduce exposure, which is very handy, and also videos, which I would offer as a resource.
Now, Yale's top OBGYN says your phone can even affect your unborn baby.
I think we need to warn people to keep their cell phones away from their abdomen, keep their cell phones away from their unborn baby if we want that baby's brain to develop normally and that child not to have behavioral problems later in life.
Dr. Taylor also found that infants and children whose brains were exposed to cell phone radiation were more likely to have behavioral issues.
Doctors and scientists from across the country taking on this issue during a pediatric conference at the Baltimore Convention Center. Panelists also finding a connection between exposure to cell phone radiation and other health issues.
There's a correlation between cell phone use in pregnancy and behavioral problems in their children.
These devices are really stressing and straining our family relationships, because the average mom or dad will check their phone 60 to 110 times a day.
Doctors say the infant brain, even while in the womb, is especially vulnerable.
Keep the phone away from the abdomen, especially toward the end of pregnancy.
Experts say holding your phone even a few inches away can lower risk. They recommend using headsets, and when you're not on your phone, keep it as far away from you as possible.
So we're getting like a triple, quadruple whammy between the biological effects, the psychological effects, and the brainwave effects.
One thing that most people are unaware of is that in all phones and wireless devices, there is a fine print manufacturer warning stated by the manufacturer. So for example, with phones, I have here the iPhone 4. Carry the iPhone at least 10 millimeters away from your body to ensure exposure levels are at or below FCC, it's about FCC limits. With laptops, it's usually 20 centimeters, which is about 8 inches. Decked phone bases as well is about 8 inches. And everything that's wireless has a statement about radio frequency. And what this means is that when devices come to market, they are tested to meet our FCC limits, which are outdated and not applicable to children, not protective to many populations and really everyone, because they don't protect for biological effects, but nonetheless they exist. However, when the device is touching the body, for most devices, such as PCs and phones, they will exceed our government limits. So because they're not tested in that way, because the regulations are antiquated. And you can go online and also read all of those fine print warnings as well. Now, what happens is when a device is going on full power, and these tests are all done at the highest power, sort of the worst case scenario. There's been documentation about how showing that when devices are tested at body contact, they exceed FCC limits. Recently, the French government released hundreds of tests which document this, and actually phones have been pulled off the market because of that. And what I'm going to show you is a quick clip from a CBC Marketplace news story where they took phones and tested them in body contact positions at 0 millimeter from the body, which would be touching the body, and found the results that many documented research studies have shown, and engineers know because every millimeter makes a difference when it comes to this kind of radiation.
Why don't they test the way that people use it, like next to the body?
I think if phones were tested the way people use them, none of them would pass.
The results from the first test, the way manufacturers do it, are in. All 3 phones come within the safety limit.
Okay, so that's no surprise to you?
That's no surprise.
Time to start our test the way most of us carry them.
We'll roll this thing all the way up until it touches and has a 0 gap.
Have you ever done that test for anyone else before?
No, I haven't, because it's not a requirement, so the manufacturers don't do it very often.
Not required, even though most people we talk to say this.
Yeah, I definitely would not carry it 5 millimeters from my body. I would have it very close to me.
So the tests are all done?
Tests are all finished.
And?
The number exceeded the limit. It went up significantly with each one of the phones.
That's right. The phones exceeded the safety limit when they were moved right against the body. The radiation absorbed increased 3 to 4 times.
And in light of that, the Berkeley, California passed the cell phone right to know ordinance, where retailers are to inform the public with the following sentence. If you carry or use your phone in a pants or shirt pocket or tucked into a bra when the phone is on and connected to a wireless network, you may exceed the federal guidelines for exposure to radio frequency radiation. Now, when the ordinance was passed, it also said this potential risk is greater for children, but that was taken out over the course of the litigation that followed because the wireless industry has sued Berkeley, and it's gone to the Supreme Court, and you can learn more about that on all of our websites as well. I want to point out Dr. Moskowitz at UC Berkeley's website, which is Safer EMR, is another really important resource. He has a scientific blog on this issue and has been working on this as well. So in terms of international policy, there are, again, over a dozen countries which are doing a lot on this issue. So France and Israel and Cyprus banned Wi-Fi in kindergarten. There are cell phones banned for for young children. You can't sell cell phones designed for young children in France and Belgium as well. There are, in schools, for example, in Cyprus, removal of wireless in elementary schools. And all of that is also on our website as well. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what's happening in the United States. But it's really fascinating what other countries are doing. Cyprus has some really incredible public service announcements that are worth watching. They're 1 to 3 minutes long, and they talk about how to reduce exposure for teens, for pregnant women, and to families.
Εκπαιδευτικοί σύλλογοι στην Ευρώπη συμβουλεύουν ότι θα πρέπει να μειωθεί η έκθεση των παιδιών στην ακτινοβολία που εκπέμπουν τα κινητά τηλέφωνα, tablets και οι συνδέσεις μέσω Wi-Fi, ιδίως στο σπίτι και στο σχολείο.
Η έκθεση των παιδιών σε ηλεκτρονικό νέφος εγκυμονεί κινδύνους. Η χρήση των κινητών και συσκευών Wi-Fi από παιδιά μικρότερα των 14 ετών πρέπει να αποφεύγεται. Προφυλάξτε την υγεία και το μέλλον των παιδιών σας. Το ίδιο ισχύει και για την έγκυο. Οι έφηβοι ποτέ δεν βάζουν το κινητό στο υπνοδωμάτιο τους, στις τσέπες τους, στα μπράτσα ή κοντά στο στήθος τους. Πάντα χρησιμοποιούν hands-free και κρατούν το κινητό μακριά από το σώμα τους.
Αξιοποιώ την τεχνολογία σωστά. Γνωρίζω τους κινδύνους και δεν εξαρτώμαι από αυτή. Χρησιμοποιώ ενσύρματη σύνδεση για τον υπολογιστή του σπιτιού μου και ενεργοποιώ το Wi-Fi και τα δεδομένα κινητής τηλεφωνίας μόνο όταν χρειάζεται και ποτέ όταν τα παιδιά μου είναι κοντά. Δεν χρησιμοποιώ κινητό τηλέφωνο στο αυτοκίνητο όταν τα παιδιά μου βρίσκονται σε αυτό. Η έκθεση στην ακτινοβολία είναι πολύ μεγαλύτερη. Προστατεύω πάντα τα παιδιά μου.
Η Γαλλία ήδη με νόμο απαγόρευσε τη χρήση Wi-Fi σε παιδικούς σταθμούς και σε χώρους όπου φιλοξενούνται παιδιά κάτω των 3 χρόνων. Επιτρέπει ελάχιστη χρήση στα σχολεία κάτω από αυστηρούς περιορισμούς.
Στον νηπιαγωγείο, στο σχολείο και στο σπίτι περνάμε τουλάχιστον το 75% του χρόνου μας.
απαιτούν μια ασφάλεια χωρίς ακτινοβολίες από Wi-Fi, κινητά και άλλες ασύρματες συνδέσεις. Η υγεία είναι δικαίωμα. Είμαστε στερείτε.
Δεν έχουμε το δικαίωμα να ρισκάρουμε την υγεία των παιδιών μας αναμένοντας παθητικά τους άλλους να κάνουν κάτι. Ας ξεχάσουμε τι είναι βολικό για μας και ας τους χαρίσουμε το καλύτερο δώρο, την υγεία τους, μετατρέποντας το σπίτι και το σχολείο σε όαση προστασίας.
Το σπίτι μου είναι όαση αγάπης και ασφάλειας. Σβήνω τα Wi-Fi και άλλες ασύρματες συνδέσεις όταν δεν χρησιμοποιούνται και κυρίως όταν τα παιδιά είναι στο σπίτι και τα κλείνω πάντοτε το βράδυ. Αξιοποιώ το κουμπάκι on-off. Είναι τόσο απλό να μειώσω το χρόνο αχρίαστης έκθεσης. Επενδύω στην υγεία των παιδιών μου μακροχρόνια.
Η ζωή και το μέλλον τους είναι στα δικά μας χέρια. Δώστε στα παιδιά ένα μοναδικό δώρο ζωής, την υγεία τους.
So let's talk about the classroom, and I'm also going to talk about what's happening in the United States too. There are many teacher unions and educational organizations in North America who've issued resolutions, reports, and resources on how to reduce exposure. I have a list here, and those are all on the website on a webpage on teacher union action under the policy heading.
The Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation wants a moratorium on Wi-Fi in the Limestone School Board. The teacher union's president says there is a growing mountain of evidence that Wi-Fi can pose health risks, concerns that Andrea Loken is taking to school trustees.
There are thousands of published peer-reviewed papers that are indicating adverse health effects from Wi-Fi. And we are seeing an increasing awareness around this issue worldwide.
Loken says countries like France, Israel, and Italy are all taking steps to ban Wi-Fi in schools and daycares. The World Health Organization has listed Wi-Fi in the same category as other potentially cancer-causing substances.
That's in the same category as lead, exhaust fumes, DDT.
The Elementary Teachers Federation supports calls for a Wi-Fi school ban, adding there are also teachers who suffer from electrohypersensitivity.
Symptoms are not the same in every person because it's not an easy diagnosis to get, and when you do get a diagnosis you have to go to Toronto to get it.
Both teacher union leaders say their fight isn't with the school board. They say they want to raise awareness about the need for a Wi-Fi moratorium until further health studies are completed and lawmakers can catch up with new regulations.
We're going to the trustees because they are the only group that can really make the blanket decision for the board.
No one from the Limestone District School Board was available for an on-camera interview, but they did issue this statement that reads in part, providing safe and appropriate places to learn and work is a priority for the Limestone District School Board. Trustees understand and are sensitive to the safety concerns some community members have regarding the use of Wi-Fi in schools. Loken says there are alternatives like Ethernet to deliver the internet and technology into classrooms. Darren Davis, CKWS Newswatch, Kingston.
So just as an example, this is the Canadian Teacher Federation. It's a snapshot of the web page. They have a briefing document on this issue that they have a committee created a report. This is from the New York Teacher Union webpage, and they also did a webinar, which I really recommend. It's with Grassroots Environmental Education, Patty Wood, and she interviews with Dr. Magda Havas. I hope that this webinar will spur you to learn more, and I would highly recommend this webinar as well. The Ontario English Catholic Teachers Association did a position paper, and a lot of what I'm going to talk about now, they talk about in their report. So they are writing about the exposure of Wi-Fi and how to reduce radio frequency to as low as reasonably achievable by applying the concept of prudent avoidance. And most recently, and we just posted on this on Environmental Health Trust, Castle Hill High School issued mobile phone safety tips and cyberbullying info, and it is fantastic. They have many recommendations to get educated in things that you can do to reduce exposure to cell phones and wireless, and also addressing cyberbullying. So in the classroom, and we had a teacher and a nurse, and because of our rescheduling of this, I apologize that they're not able to be with us today. Healthy routines in the classroom. What reminders can we do at the beginning of class? So a reminder to power off phones when the class starts, you know, just reminding everyone to turn your phones off. And I respect that that is really complicated and that there are kids that are not going to do that. But I think it's our job as adults, and I have certainly worked in camps and in the schools. I'm a clinical social worker for many years in the school system. So we still need to do what we can do. And I just want to say that I respect that this is much easier said than done. You got to start somewhere. A reminder to keep the phones away from the body, to turn your devices onto airplane mode. Because something that's really important to know is that every device, even if you're not using it, is radiating and connecting with their base station or with the cell tower. So you might not even be using something and it's still going to be emitting pulses to connect, and that is radiation. So turn it on airplane mode. Not to have curriculum where you need to be Googling on phones during class. And that requires pre-planning, something that we're doing a lot less of with the rollout of technology. Posting the California Department of Public Health guidelines on the wall as well. And I know that the nurse who was going to present, she has recommendations by the American Academy of Pediatrics in her office. Just an example of what is happening here in Baltimore, this is from our website, not having the laptops on the lap. These are images from the integration of technology, a one-on-one program that we have. And all devices should always be on a table, whether the Wi-Fi is on or off actually, because of the ELF that they emit. There is scientific imaging that we have online as well, which is from state-of-the-art computer modeling showing the radiation coming off of the antennas and then the penetration into the body. And you can go online to see those. And they show how the body and the tissues of the body are absorbing this radiation. And this is a laptop on the lap. Now in Ashland, Massachusetts, they are the first public school system to post best practices for digital devices. It's in every classroom. They have teacher training on this every year. And I have to the left the best practices, and to the right, a great resource, Cece Duche of Understanding EMF. She's an educator, and that is her presenting to the Board of Health. Really recommend that video as well. So here we have an example of a school system that is taking an approach to inform and reduce exposure to students. And this is another picture from Baltimore. And so children should be at the desk, keeping a distance from the screen with a healthy posture. And posture is another issue that has really concerned me, is how kids are using these devices. Because we're using them for so long, it's not okay to be sitting down with them on your lap and hunching over your neck, your back. This is not healthy for our bodies. And this other image I brought up because if there are children all sitting close to each other and the devices are on that are wireless, then you have to remember that the child in front of the device is also in close range to that and absorbing some of the radiation from that device. I know when I see children using devices, they're like, if there are 4 of them, they're all like almost eating the device. They're just so close to it and unaware. Parents are unaware. Teachers are unaware that if they're emitting radiation, that our bodies are absorbing that radiation, and that can be addressed by keeping things on a table, by having the wireless off, by having the curriculum downloaded first so that it's not needing to be connecting to utilize it. I also wanted to point out that the first draft of the California Department of Health cell phone advisory, there were drafts going back to 2009 that Dr. Moskowitz was able to bring out with actually a lawsuit, was do not allow children to use cell phones except for emergencies. And there, I have over 150 pages of drafts now to show everything that went on. They were written and rewritten, and I'm so thankful that they have finally come out for people to be educated on phones and wireless devices.
In fact, the first draft of the California State Cell Phone Radiation Advisory was about what state governments and its employees can do to lower potential risks from cordless phones and cell phones, and it was actually specifically for state employees and had recommendations, which include don't purchase cordless phones for office use because, of course, home cordless phones emit the same type of radiation, radio frequency, as cell phones do. And their bases now, the DEC phone bases, are very high emitters. They're all the time, whether you're using the cordless phone or not. And there was even in these early drafts of the state California Department of Health recommendations to create contract language to require manufacturers to provide SAR ratings. That has to do with the absorption of the radiation into the body. It's a measurement metric. And to offer low emission accessories in regards to purchases for employees. So actually it was an occupational health measure that was being drafted and redrafted, and it changed many times, and you can go to the environmental health website to learn more about that.
So if you have laptops, tablets, turn them off when not in use. This is a simple start. The Wi-Fi, the Bluetooth, the cellular, and place them in airplane mode. It's really important to remember that sometimes airplane mode isn't good enough and you have to turn off Siri and Bluetooth and all the other antennas. It depends on the device. I talked about downloading the curriculum first. And laptop carts, store the carts outside of the classroom. Avoid recharging them near students and staff because there are extremely low frequency fields that come off of electrical lines, and when you're really close to something that there's a lot of electricity, then you can be exposed to that as well. And the next steps for school in terms of policy and administration is going to be really critically looking at how best to implement technology in a balanced and healthy way. So our recommendation is new policies for cell phones and digital device use that include these health and safety issues. And not just about, more than just the radiation as well, but also addiction and the overuse. And there's so much with our use of cell phones and wireless that we need to develop policy for to inform and educate students. Corded phones in every room, and for students in common areas as well.
So this is a Wi-Fi access point, and Wi-Fi routers are similar to Wi-Fi access points. They're in rooms. They're usually on the ceiling of classrooms. Sometimes you'll see them on the wall up high. They emit radiation. They create wireless radiation exposures in the classroom.
CHIPS, Collaborative for High Performance Schools, has developed criteria on low EMF, and that's also on our website, which outlines all of this as well. So there's criteria in place.
Cell phones in the classroom. There needs to be new policy to ensure that cell phones are powered off in classes as a school or district policy. The United Kingdom, France, Rwanda, provinces in China are already doing this. They are outlawing cell phones in elementary and certainly middle schools. There are high schools in the United States that are banning cell phones altogether. We know that cell phones are impeding learning, they are distracting, kids are texting, they're getting into fights, all kinds of things are happening because of phones in the classroom. In fact, I have yet to see where a phone in the classroom supports learning objectives. So a ban can go far, and of course that does mean that you have to set up a way that there can be communication, not just within the school, but for kids to be able to reach their parents, to do last-minute planning, and all the things that are happening now with the crazy after-school schedules that kids have. Things change. They have to have a phone that they can call their parents. And there needs to be a system that a parent can call the school, and it's not an imposition for the school to get the message to the student.
This new study by the London School of Economics getting the attention of school systems all across the country. Scores improved overall, but the biggest difference was in kids who usually struggle. Texting, tweeting, trying to get to the next level of Candy Crush. All while the teacher is talking. A new study by the London School of Economics says it's a recipe for slumping test scores. Check out these marks. Grades improved 6.4% overall when cell phones were banned, but underachievers saw an even bigger spike. Their grades improved by 14%. This new study says banning phones increases productivity so much it's equal to adding an hour to every school week. The sampling was broad, 130,000 students from 91 schools all across England.
The New Jersey Educational Association has put out a great post. They also have a 2-pager. I have one of the pages right here about addressing all the health risks from electronic devices. I recommend that as a great resource. It's important to educate students and teachers and for ourselves to have our bedroom be a sleep sanctuary. You know, turn off, get the electronics out. Don't sleep with your phone. Use a battery-powered alarm clock instead of your cell phone, or if you use your cell phone, turn it on airplane mode. And turning off screens at least an hour, I'd say 2 hours before bedtime, or get a blue light blocker, of course, so that it's not stimulating your brain before you go to bed. And also turning off the Wi-Fi at night is what a lot of people do when they first learn about this issue in order to reduce that exposure. These are images from the Santa Clara Medical Association articles that Dr. Russell has written, and there's actually many that she's written which are excellent about Wi-Fi in schools, about learning. Dr. Martha Herbert of Harvard has a piece in the Autism Notebook about electromagnetic fields. Environmental Health Trust has created a lot of, we have posters, we have safety cards, we have 2-pagers in black and white or in color that you can print out. On the back of each of these images you see on the left are the American Academy of Pediatrics recommendations to reduce exposure. So people know how to reduce exposure to their phone. There's also great videos. Generation Zapped is a movie which is now, you can get it on iTunes and just search it, you'll see what I mean, and that's a wonderful resource to learn about this issue. The webinar with the New York State Teacher Union, the Baby Safe Project videos. ABC Catalyst did a piece called Wi-Fried, which you can find on YouTube. And at the National Institutes of Health, there was a health and building conference. I presented along with Dr. Paul, Frank Clegg, former Microsoft Canada president, CC Duchette, Peter Sullivan, and I recommend those videos as well. And more at Environmental Health Trust and mdsafetech.org.
This is a big first for the California Department of Public Health. It's releasing guidelines about cell phone radiation and how you can avoid it.
When you sleep, you keep the cell phone at least arm's length from your body. And also not carrying your cell phone in your pocket, having it either in your purse or not carrying it with you.
The research suggests cell phones could increase our risk for brain cancer and tumors, low sperm count, headaches, impaired memory, hearing, and sleep.
Currently, we're not doing a good job in regulating the radiation from these devices. In fact, we're doing an abysmal job.
At one Surrey school is making sure that her students remain plugged in. So Roots and Wings Montessori is a Wi-Fi free zone, and any technology at the school is hardwired. The use of wireless internet and even cell phones has been banned due to health concerns surrounding that technology. And given the risks involving children, the principal just doesn't want to take that risk.
Whether this is true or not, the default, I think, needs to be on the side of safety. So it was very easy for me just to remove it.